So we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of this Roadshow event, Egypt. I welcome you. My name is Arpad Karit. I'm very sorry. I had a little bit of a feedback from my own voice. So my name is Arpad Gerrit. I'm an IT lawyer from Austria, Vienna. I'm specialized on cybersecurity and now also data protection due to the technical measures that we all need to take or should take to be compliant. And the show today is not about me. I'm only the moderator of a wonderful panel here. First of all, we have Yasmin Afifi. She's a corporate counsel for Middle East and North Africa region at Amazon Web Services based in Dubai. Then we have Mohammed Abdelgawad with us. He's a partner at Azero Law Firm, heading corporate, commercial, and regulatory department. He has a strong focus on technology-related matters, including cybersecurity, which I love very much, personal data protection, cloud computing regulation, and IoTs. Welcome. And last but not least on our panel is Nick Rudev. He is a senior lawyer based in Dubai at Simmons & Simmons, specializing on all aspects of regulation of data, cloud services, and you name it in the Middle East. He has co-authored papers on these subjects, and he also practiced in these areas in the law in North America and Europe. So, welcome, Nick. First of all, I would like to ask you a general question, and maybe Yasmin, you would like to start. So how important is an accommodating regulatory space to the adoption of cloud computing?
Thanks, Arpad. So I think, of course, regulation is very important when it comes to any business, not just cloud computing. But in terms of cloud, I think before we talk about regulation from a cloud service provider perspective, we always have a preliminary step before regulation is actually the actual use of cloud in country. And by that, we use how we can promote the use of cloud across country, and then how can we regulate. So there is always one step of the cloud first policy that we always encourage governments across the region to consider first, having a strategy of how the cloud will be used across the country, and how can they promote the use of cloud as a first option to the traditional IT routes. So when we talk about cloud first policy, this is a first step of regulation, encouraging governments and semi-governments to consider cloud as a first option because of the benefits that comes with cloud. Of course, this is going to be a part of the sessions coming up. And then when we talk at how we can regulate cloud after we've seen massive use of cloud across government and semi-government and across the country, we always have, of course, best practices on into things that needs to be considered. So one of those things is always for regulators and governments to think of the cost of compliance. And of course, cost of compliance can be really burdensome, especially for companies that operate across different countries. If every country have their own bespoke requirements when it comes to security, accreditation, registration, all these requirements can be very burdensome for companies to comply with. And when we talk about cost of compliance, it's not just the fees that you pay, it's also the time and resources invested in making sure that you comply with those regulations. So we always encourage governments to really think of the international accreditations that are already there for cloud providers, and they can rely on those international accreditation and not to reinvent the wheel. And this should be sufficient to address certain concerns around security and otherwise. So we always encourage governments to really think of the cost of compliance when it comes to accreditation, compliance, and security. But also, I think the regulation, when we talk accommodating regulation, it should also go beyond really a regulation into how to facilitate actually the cloud journey. How can it be a facilitator rather than like regulating? And in that sense, we also regulations should also take into consideration how can there be like a formalized way for procuring, because procurement of cloud is very different than procuring of any other services or hardware or other products. So how can this procurement process can be also integrated as part of that regulation to make the procurement process fit for cloud? Because as today, many of the regulations, the normal procurement laws does not really fit with the cloud model. So these are the things that should be taken into consideration in order for the cloud regulations to be actually enabling cloud and enabling governments to reap the benefits of cloud in terms of efficiency, flexibility, and of course cost optimization.
Thank you very much. Mohammed, what is your take on this?
Thank you, Arpad. So I definitely agree with everything that Yasmin said. From an Egyptian law perspective, I think the importance of having a clear regulatory environment with clear regulations comes from the fact that in the absence of these regulations, you would go to the general principles of law and you will have a lot of uncertainties for the businesses, which again is not in line with huge investments relating to cloud regulation. So you would not go forward with these massive investments, and then you find yourself challenged by the uncertainties in the market due to the lack of regulations. On the environmental regulatory framework for cloud regulations, we would look to two things, as the short clip that preceded our panel said. Basically, what you can do and what you should not do with the data in a cloud environment. So basically, two aspects: the protection of the rights of different stakeholders, ensuring quality, ensuring compliance on the one side, and then the balance of having how these restrictions that you will impose on the businesses would make it economically viable or unviable for the business, as Yasmin said, if these regulations require extensive costs. On another note, in Egypt, we find a lot of lack of expertise when it comes to the cloud business. So when the regulations are imposed, sometimes we find challenge with the regulators or the people working on the draft, the lawmakers, in identifying what's feasible in imposing restrictions. Sometimes some of these restrictions are not feasible to implement. So I think, in brief, the regulatory framework is crucial for cloud business, more important than other tech businesses due to the significance of investments that is being made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. So, Nick, from your very international perspective, how do you look at this question? What are your answers from one jurisdiction or the other?
I fully agree with Yasmin and Mohammed, and their perspective is fascinating. I mean, I think from a general regulatory scientific perspective, the science of regulation, if you will, the traditional position not too long ago was that the best regulation is really no regulation at all. The best for the business, that is. But I think that simplistic understanding has recently been replaced with a different understanding, a different mantra, and that is, rather than having no regulation, having the right amount of smart regulation is really optimal for business. Traditionally, again, the thinking was the less regulation you have, the less costly it is for business to comply. And so the better economic activity. The more regulation you have, the higher the cost of compliance, and so on and so forth. But I think recent developments in regulatory theory, and also which are supported by repeated surveys with the businesses, actually showing us that it's not a straight line, but it's actually a bit of a bell curve. The best regulation is really just the right amount of focused regulation, which gets to serving the public policy goals that it's supposed to serve without unnecessarily burdening companies in the most efficient and focused way. And good regulation, smart regulation, the right amount of that is actually not only helpful but critically important for businesses to develop and for innovation. Again, repeated research has shown that. And so in the space of cloud, I think and as we'll talk about later, I think one of the more important things is, for example, first to understand what are the public policy goals that regulation is supposed to serve. Very, very often, regulators, particularly in less mature environments and markets, kind of put the cart before the horse. They start with, let's have a piece of regulation without asking themselves the question, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve with it? And what's the best way to go at it? For example, if your concern is that data hosted in the cloud is not going to be very secure, is the best way of achieving security to mandate that it always stays within your country? Or maybe there's other ways, for example, as Mohammed was saying, and Yasmin as well, compliance with industry standards is better one. So I think this is the general, I think, consensus, scientific consensus, if you will, in regulatory theory these days is regulation is good. Smart regulation is good, and can actually serve public policy rationale, but it needs to be that. It needs to be smart, it needs to be focused, and it needs to be serving well identified and understood measures. It needs to be consulted with business as well, which businesses one of the key stakeholders, as well as consumers and political actors.
Thank you very much. Yes. Regulation, over-regulation, under-regulation, this is something that we have all seen or experienced in some fields or the other. And it's quite an interesting take to compare what we would say developed and developing countries with sometimes on the one or the other side of this bell curve that you've mentioned. So since we are now here virtually in Egypt and the focus is on Egypt, Mohammed, please tell us, what are the recent developments in Egypt regarding data and cloud regulation, and how do you see all of this develop in the years to come?
Well, I think that there is a lot to cover here. And maybe we start with the fact that the online space, so we need to differentiate between two things. Regulations relating to tech and the online space in general, and specific regulations relating to cloud computing and cloud business. When it comes to the general regulations, I would say that Egypt had significant delay in regulations since the early 2000s. So we had a boost at the beginning of this century with issuing we issued the first telecommunication regulation, comprehensive law in the country, and then followed by an e-signature law in 2003 and 2004, and then silence till 2018, where we have a lot of activity and a lot of regulations that were recently issued. We had the first ever cyber crimes law, which is basically a cybersecurity law imposing obligations. At the same time, a lot of criminal provisions protecting the online space and criminalizing acts and violations against this space. Where in the past, we had these academic and theoretical challenges, whether breaching data constitutes one of the traditional crimes under the law. Would it constitute any violation of privacy under very old and general criminal provisions, which was one of the most challenging aspects. And then we had the personal data protection law issued. It was very important to have a personal data protection law, and the process itself was very interesting to see the real challenges. So it's not about the laws that will be issued. I think the key challenge will be about the enforcement and implementation, the capacity building on the government side and on the industry side as well, when it comes to the specific area of cybersecurity and personal data protection. And then we also had a new law regulating media, which I think is going in the counter direction. So all the laws that I have talked about were all moving in the direction of enabling the tech, enabling the online space, with a lot of comments, of course, on them, but the general direction is in enabling direction. And then we had the media regulations and the media law issued also in 2018. I'm saying it's going in the opposite side, more restrictive, a lot of uncertainty about the content restrictions and the ability of the government to restrict or allow content, a lot of licensing requirements for the different players, and significant ambiguity and uncertainty until date about the scope of application, whether it extends to online activities, what would constitute a website according to the law and so on, whether it's restricted to media and journalism, or it is open to a broader scope of all online activities. And at the same time, I think, duration in starting 2017 till today, we also had a lot of specialized legislations that were issued that are industry specific. So we had a new ride-hailing law to regulate the likes of Uber and Careem in Egypt for the first time, and use of technology in transportation in general as a basis. And then we now have a draft fintech law for non-banking financial services and use of technology on this front. We have a cashless payments law, which encourages cashless payments. Yes, it includes also other non-tech means of payment, like bank checks, for example, but the direction is going towards the more tech-related payment solutions. So of course we have the IP law, and I think there is no issue with the law itself. I think the issue when it comes to IP would be more related to enforcement and actual protection of IP rights. So that's the general framework for the online industry. I would again use the same division that I made, and I would talk about what's missing and what we would like to see in the next years as an addition to the regulatory framework. So we have uncertainty on the regulation of liability for intermediaries, whether there is a safe harbor, whether there is not, liability on marketplace operators, whether they are liable on what's going on the marketplace or not. So on the cloud, this will be very important, the extent of liability for the cloud operator on the data that is being processed through the data center, and the ability of control and interception on this front. So lawful interception and the due process is one of the key topics that needs clarity and needs to be addressed in the regulations. I think also there is a gap when it comes to AI regulations, and all the regulations that were issued until date is not taking into consideration the challenges that come with AI and the degree of actual and practical control of the different players on AI and the limitation, the ability of AI to comply with the restrictions in these laws when it comes to limits on data processing and personal data processing as well. Then we have a topic, I don't think it's related to Egypt, but it's more of a global one, and I know that there are a lot of progress here, but again, it's also part of the uncertainty which relates to tax and doing business. And I think it is very important when it comes to cloud business, because sometimes the data component that will use the cloud computing services could represent the most extensive part of the business activity of the player, and how much this would trigger a tax residency in a specific country. I think this is also something that requires a lot of clarity and how tax will be applied on these. So that's on the general online space. When it comes to cloud regulations itself, we do not have a lot of regulations that are issued, But we are aware, and it's common, it's now in the public consultation, we are aware of a draft regulation on the licensing for cloud services. The draft is issued by the National Telecommunication Regulatory Authority. It is generally focusing on the licensing of these services and enabling them and encouraging and trying to resolve a lot of issues that are facing them. The good news is that the draft that I have seen is actually following what Yasmin and Nick were referring to, following the concept of recognizing the international standards and the accreditation. Actually, the regulations themselves, they do mention the international accreditations that are known for the industry by name in the regulations themselves, and they just adopt them as the standards for the industry, which is great to apply. Our comments would be that this regulation will require some law backup. So it's based on the telecommunication law, which is relatively old, in 2003, and we have heard a lot about discussions relating to its update, but it never happened. What's missing, what we have not seen being addressed until now in a more serious manner, or we see initial drafts or something, I think data classification and sharing, which is very challenging. Until now, a lot of stakeholders in the market confuse between personal data protection and data in general, not non-personal data, and how to deal with it and how to act with it. And with Egypt's objective and an announced objective to become a data hub, an international data hub, I think addressing data transit regulations and how to deal with them is also crucial to have in place. Cybersecurity for cloud should go under the cybersecurity law. Our comment is that the law is very generic. The requirements are not specific, are not industry specific, and lack a lot of maturity. It requires a lot of effort. We do not have until now a clear cybersecurity standards for cloud computing, which is generally different in other jurisdictions than normal cybersecurity standards. The cross-border component is one of the, as Nick said, is one of the most challenging topics. Currently, there is no law prohibiting cross-border transfer except the latest personal data protection law, which requires a license. It's still in a grace period. But for other data, there is no legal restriction. However, as a matter of practice, we know that all regulators do restrict, whenever they are able to do so, the transfer of data outside of Egypt. This goes for the National Telecommunication Regulatory Authorities and all telecom operators. This goes for the Central Bank of Egypt as well, for all the banks operating in Egypt, which is very challenging to businesses. So that's again an overview. There's a lot to say, but just to be mindful of the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Well, you've already touched some of the topics. Like, I think the most important one is now the cross-border transfer of data. Nick, you've already mentioned this topic, so maybe you would like to expand on this. So, in your point of view, how should policymakers approach data protection and cross-border data transfer, especially to enable cloud adoption?
Yeah, thank you, Arpad. I think this is it's a very good question, and I've been listening to Mohammed, and I sort of cannot disagree with anything that he said. Cross-border data transfers, again, just to go back to what I said initially, the best practice in designing regulation and writing regulation is to first start by thinking what are the problems that you're trying to address with this piece of regulation. And it seems to me people latch on to one of the possible solutions, which is restricting data transfers, without thinking of what really comes before then. So if we take data restriction and data transfers from the point of view of, for example, the Egyptian legislature or regulator in Egypt, what are the possible problems with cloud services that could be potentially addressed with cross-border data transfers? traditionally, when we think of cloud computing, we think of, for example, problems of security. So services on the cloud we need to ensure that these services are secure. They're secure from vulnerabilities, from viruses, unauthorized access, and so on and so forth. And so we need to ensure that any data that's resident on the cloud is also free from vulnerability and is not going to be exposed to unauthorized access or whether by a malignant third party or by, let's say, a foreign or domestic government agency that's not supposed to view it. So security is one. Resilience is another potential public policy goal. You might want to ensure, for example, the telecom regulator of Egypt, that whatever cloud service there is resilient, particularly since the growing dependence of all kinds of critical infrastructure and critical domestic services on the cloud. Resilience becomes very important. In other words, you don't want something that happened in the UAE when a bank went offline basically for a month because a core system went down. You don't want that happening to cloud systems. So you need to ensure that they're resilient. Another problem that's frequently faced is the problem of consumer protection and not distorting the market. With a few dominant cloud services providers out there, you want to make sure that the market does not get distorted and consumers are protected. You also want to ensure that that not only in kind of a lateral, horizontal, competitive manner, but you also want to ensure that consumer rights are protected. In other words, that cloud services contracts are not being imposed, but are being, by and large, fair to the parties involved. And then finally, last but not least, and people frequently ignore this, I think it's a legitimate public policy rationale to say that governments want to ensure that their developmental goals are respected. So, if particularly from the point of view of a country like Egypt, which is actually one of the few countries that actually grew during the COVID pandemic and is very focused on economic growth, ensuring the development of a domestic cloud industry could be a very, very valid public policy rationale. So if we take a look at, for example, these 4 public policy goals, and we ask ourselves the question, okay, well, cross-border data transfer restrictions, are these going to actually work to address any of these 4 goals? Are they the best instrument to deploy to address these 4 goals? I think that's why the answers start emerging as to whether it actually is prudent to impose them, and if so, to what extent and in what manner. And again, just to go very quickly over how I would see, if I was the Egypt regulatory authority or legislature, this, for example, from the point of view of the public policy goal of ensuring the security of data resident on the cloud, is requiring that all data be hosted physically within the borders of Egypt really going to be all that useful in ensuring that it's not hacked into or not accessed in an unauthorized way? I mean, we've got cybersecurity law experts here on the panel that I'm sure will agree with me when I say that I don't think so. And in fact, Yasmin there will probably tell you that from the point of view of major industry players, actually they're much more likely and much more capable of ensuring a high level of security of your data on a public cloud than kind of a private on-premises cloud that's run locally and maybe not maintained to the same standard. So all in all, I wouldn't think that restricting cross-border data transfers and requiring it be physically kept within Egypt is really going to help ensure security, and perhaps not the best way. What about resilience? What about ensuring the data is always accessible? Right. Again, I think the analysis is broadly the same as with with ensuring security of the data. I don't think that a public cloud run by Amazon, globally, is any less resilient than an on-premises cloud, which has got a backup somewhere, also in Egypt in a remote location. And then what about consumer protection? Here people will frequently tell you, well, requiring the data be kept locally within the country is actually a great way to ensure that it doesn't fall into the hands of foreign governments. So your privacy will be respected, your privacy will be protected. But then we look at the Egypt Personal Data Protection Law, for example, and we find, to our surprise, that government is generally excluded from its application. So by and large, the Egypt government has access to your data anyway. And so, I suppose restricting it from going abroad, you will say is, for example, trying to avoid it falling into the hands of the American government from your, human rights perspective. But that's certainly not the case because the Cloud Act, and so whether you keep it within Egypt or not, at the end of the day, when national security considerations come into play, that's really not going to be your shield. So I think potentially you could say, coming to the last goal that I spoke about, that is ensuring the economic development of your own domestic cloud industry, and I think countries like China and India, and I think Egypt is in that basket as well, have been very vocal about basically the requirement of a level playing field. Is this really going to be a panacea? I think the argument here is probably the strongest by requiring data localization, together with, I think, Mohammed, you mentioned briefly the new cloud computing or cloud services provision licensing framework in Egypt, which was enacted only, came out only a few months ago. I think the upshot of that, of data localization under the personal data protection law, which I understand is in the grace period, but still is there, and we're still waiting for the executive regulations to find out, what the potential exclusions to that are going to be honed. But ultimately, both of these are driving to the same thing: establish your data centers here in Egypt, and with that, grow Egypt's domestic homegrown cloud computing industry. So you could say, okay, this is one way in which data residency actually is helpful to the country. But I wonder if that's really the best way of going at it. It's a blunt instrument. Isn't it better to incentivize the development of local cloud computing industry in other ways, more elegant ways, rather than brutally forcing major players to basically localize domestically? And isn't it better to, for example, ensure a more, other incentives to cloud computing providers to set up locally and to develop locally, rather than, using the stick, use the carrot, in other words? I think so. From all of that, I think risk. I think data, to the extent that data residency requirements do exist, and sometimes, again, as I said, they can serve a legitimate purpose, they need to be very finely tuned. They need to be, first, I think, risk-based. They need to be led by sector needs. So in some sectors, there's probably a greater need for ensuring the data is stored locally than in others. So a general data localization requirement is probably not a very good idea. Whereas, for example, in the healthcare space or maybe in the financial services space, there may be a much more pressing rationale for ensuring that. So leave it to the sector. The second, leave it to the industry to lead. There's already industry standards out there that are they've got very robust requirements. For example, the ISO standard for processing personal data on the cloud. Leave it to the industry and leave it to the sectors. And finally, consider where the data is going outside of your country. If it's rather than having a blanket requirement of just don't transfer it outside of the country, consider the end jurisdiction, consider a risk-based approach. Some, not all jurisdictions are created equal. Some are much more okay for your data to go into than others.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick. So we all agree that there's room for improvement, not only in Egypt, but also in other countries. So Yasmin, you've already mentioned in the very beginning some some things that maybe regulators do not consider. Also taking in mind the technical knowledge or maybe lack thereof in some of the regulators' offices around the world, what are the general misconceptions around data and cloud that you are aware of and which you would like them to be aware of as well?
Thanks, Arpad. Very interesting, spot on comments from the panel today. And so, of course, day in, day out throughout the region, in my day-to-day work, we have to work on correcting general misconceptions around data and cloud. And I would focus on 2 points. I think one of them already we've touched upon intensively around the data residency. I'll come to that later, but I would like to first start about the data security. So most of the time, there is this concept that cloud service provider, it is your responsibility to secure the customer data. It is your responsibility. So that's the misconception. And the starting point of any negotiation, you are the cloud provider, you secure the data. And from a cloud service provider perspective, security is a shared responsibility. So you can, and this is what we call it, the shared responsibility model. And by this, we mean that as a cloud provider, we are responsible for the security of the cloud. And by cloud, I mean we have to provide a secure infrastructure that runs the services. This includes hardware, software, facilities, physical facilities, networking that runs the cloud services. So this is the security of the cloud. And then the customer responsibility is security in the cloud and how they are going to use the cloud. And I think there is a later session today focusing on security in the cloud. And I think this would go into much depth on what it means. But in high level, customer responsibility will be determining like how they are going to use the service, and how they are going to secure their data, what tools they are going to use, how they are going to architect the services to meet their business needs. So you can imagine like the amount of misperceptions about this key concept can create when it comes to regulation, when it comes to the customer's view of the liabilities and indemnities in a contract for cloud services, and how this can even shape tender requirements. And we have seen many tenders, regulations, contracts that would say, okay, CSP, you shall ensure data is encrypted, you shall ensure that data stays in country, that data is classified, that you implement and ensure backup, disaster recovery, like business continuity. All these measures is within the customer control. So think of cloud as tools, and how you use those tools, how you choose to use those tools, and the risk assessment on how you use those tools remains with the customer. So again, to elaborate a little bit more, so customer choose where they want to store their data, which region. They can choose whether or not to encrypt their data. It's not, we do not dictate on customers to encrypt data, because if it's a public information, they don't need to encrypt it, for example. So encryption, whether they want to have a backup, whether they want to have a disaster recovery storage somewhere other than their country, all these are requirements that within the customer control, they decide who have the access to the data, who get authorized access to the data, and they have the right to architect the way that meets their business needs. So for example, they can use the cloud to store data for archive purpose, but they can also use it for a very mission critical, like for example, payment service, that if it goes down or something goes wrong, or it's going to have a huge impact on their operations. So it's really within the customer control to have the level of risk assessment that they are willing to accept, and how they architect the services in a way that meets their business needs. As a cloud provider, we do not have visibility on what is the data, what it means to your business, how critical it is. Like, we don't have that visibility of the value of the data to you, and whether you have implemented of course there are as a cloud provider, there are training, certification, best practices, but you have to implement those best practices in order to protect the data. So security in the cloud, very big topic, and I'm sure there will be a session focused on that today. And I would like to move to the second misperception, is also about data residency, meaning that if you require data to be on premise or in country, this automatically means better security. And I think already, Nick, you touched upon that and spot on those comments you raised. So again, traditionally, we have seen government and customer thinking of, okay, if I'm hosting data locally on premise in a physically accessible facility within country, then it's, well, I'm in great shape. And having full ownership of the whole stack, including like the building, the software, everything, this is the rationale that really still exists today. But as the technology evolves, I think it's really important to understand that really security is not really about the physical location. There are so many factors that contribute to the security of data. This includes that once you have data connected to the internet, whether in country, out of country, on premise, or at a CSP facility, there is vulnerability that can be exploited remotely from anywhere in the world. So whether or not the data is in or outside the country, it doesn't really have a lot of bearing in that process. And of course, the human error. There are a lot of cybersecurity attacks that happen because of human error, lack of updating to software in the on-premise data center, or for example, always we focus on unauthorized access when many of the exploitation happens because of an authorized access that has been be malicious or unintentional. So just this is as the two general misconceptions that we look into and we try to create awareness around them throughout our work, day in, day out. I would like to also end by few points on those misperceptions and how can they be avoided. And I think already Mohammed Abdel Gawad, he touched upon the point of capacity building. And this is really important because when we talk about capacity building, it's usually around IT professionals and also around business professionals. I think it's also really very important to focus on creating awareness and training lawyers, not just IT and business departments, lawyers, procurement professional, finance, contracts people, on understanding at a high level what is the technologies they are trying to adopt in their organization and what it means to them. So the necessity for lawyers to really understand technology has become really indispensable. And this is not just applicable to lawyers like the people on this panel where we specialize in technology. It is going to become necessity for every lawyer in every sector to really understand what is technology, because today, governments, private sector, non-profit organization, healthcare, education, they are all looking into adopting new technologies, AI, cloud, and others, in order to make their work more efficient. And the lawyers at those organizations, regardless how big or small the organization, they will need to sit and negotiate a technology contract one way or another. So it's really important for lawyers to of all sectors to really understand what is the how to understand the technology. And I would like to end by just a final comment from my side, because usually whenever I attend any workshop, there is the ever repeated question: will robots replace lawyers? And my answer to this question is robots will not replace lawyers, but lawyers who understand technology are going to replace lawyers who don't. So lawyers out there and business people out there, train your lawyers on technology and make them bulletproof for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. So I do hope that our audience has received some material from this panel to make them bulletproof for the future. And also maybe some of the people in power who listen to this have gotten some interesting ideas about the room for improvement to the regulatory landscape they are shaping. So thank you very much, all of you. Jasmine, Mohammed, Nick, it has been a great pleasure hosting you here. I think you will be also here, or later on, the data will be shared for the audience to ask you any additional supplementary question or more detailed ones. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the next panel. Omid, the stage is now yours.